Hey guys, welcome to this week's podcast episode for the Financial Freedom Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Christopher Liu. And as you know, I'm always in the marketplace for top talent, top ideas, leadership, insights, distinctions, creating a forum where authentic, organic conversations can grow and sharing it with you guys. So today I'm really happy to introduce Elise Besler, and she's a voice and embodied life and leadership coach, but more importantly, because a lot of these ideas around burnouts and talking about nervous system regulation, somatic healing, parasympathetics is a fascinating concept. And I'm happy to welcome Elise to the show. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm always interested in physiology, spirituality, energy, these kind of techniques and kind of just getting understanding where it fits in. So tell us about your story, your background, how you got started and what you do.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. Thanks for asking. This is one of my favorite questions to answer because I've finally honed it down to a reasonably a reasonable length in the answer. Well, it started way back when I was born. But yeah, essentially, I like to start, this part of my story by just saying that I started out as a painfully shy child. I used to hide behind my mother's legs, and I wasn't ever really able to speak up. When I was a kid, I just had this like crippling fear of speaking, and yet I also loved to sing. And so I had this like sort of dichotomy going on inside of my body. So I ended up studying voice, and I ended up studying, performance, and I learned how to hone, my own nervous system responses. But I also started coaching voice, and that's how I really got into this idea of understanding how the nervous system plays a huge role in our ability to be able to show up authentically in our lives. Particularly because I was working with public speakers and singers who inevitably came to me with trauma. And polyvagal theory, which is a nervous system study, tells us that every time we have trauma, we are affected at the voice and the breath level. And so I started studying and sort of diving into this world of how the nervous system can help us, show up in that authentic way. And it also, bonus, helped me in my own life as well. And I was able to really hone in on that fear of showing up and that fear of being visible. And so that's sort of how I've come to this point in my career, where I'm supporting, coaches and leaders and performers, people who really want to be visible and have that feeling of felt sense of safety when they show up in front of other people.
I love that. And I love this really fascinating how you came to this through voice and basically how people expressive and the first thing to go is your voice, which is quite very, I've never heard of that aspect. But so you mentioned something called polyvagal theory and
Yeah.
kind of just for the audience, just kind of big overview, and then we'll get into your work.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, polyvagal theory is a nervous system theory, a nervous system study that was founded by Dr. Stephen Porges. And I've studied with a woman named Deb Dana, who has basically taken the theory and brought it down into, for us all to be able to understand it, so that it's still very sciencey, but it allowed folks like myself who are not scientists to be able to come into the work and to be able to understand how to learn how to regulate our own nervous systems, but then also so that we can co-regulate with other people. And that's so important in leadership, right? To be able to understand what's happening in somebody else and to be able to meet that and match that in a way that feels really safe. So yeah, it's a really incredible, I always say, if anyone is curious about polyvagal theory, please check it out. There's lots of resource on the internet, but definitely check out Deb Dana's work, because she's done a great job of making it digestible for everyone.
Yeah, yeah. I think the book that you're referring to, and I was reading, I was like, it was reminding me of physiology back in, first year of medical school, just kind of the talking about parasympathetics. And what's interesting is, because you mentioned this idea, the voice and the breath are the first thing to go, but
Mm-hmm.
then, talking to healers and coaches, life coaches, they said it all starts with the breath. So, which is kind of the entry, the gateway for regulating your, mind and emotion. One thing you talk about is where does nervous system regulation fall in your coaching and leadership?
Is number one. It's number one. It's that felt sense of safety. From a neurosomatic perspective, and again, this is the work that I've studied, and I've been mentored in. When we explore changing the signal, right? The signal that comes from the body to the brain, like 80% of our felt sense of safety comes from the signals that our body is giving our brain, right? And so if we can sort of shift the quality, the quality of the lead, if you will, coming into the brain at that felt sense of safety on an embodied level, there's just so much more possible, because the outputs that the brain creates is just, it's less threat, right? It's not seeing as much threat. And so nervous system stuff is where we begin, and it's where we continue when I'm working with my one-to-one clients. And I also work in groups and retreat format and, in group programs and stuff. But yeah, it's number one. Like, I think it's most important. And in polyvagal theory, we're talking, it's, specifically talking about the vagus nerve. And I'm assuming, I know you have a lot of physicians that listen to your podcast, so they know what the vagus nerve is. But yeah, just like really allowing ourselves to be able to vacillate between those mobilized states and those states that are a little bit more, in that calm state. I don't want to speak for everybody, but I think the majority of the world is kind of in this heightened state right now, right? Particularly people who are in, leadership positions and people who are supporting other people, right? And also just like consuming the media, everything that we're consuming really keeps us in that heightened state. And so anytime we can get into that calm state and that parasympathetic state, I think it's bonus, right? No matter what you're doing in your life, whether it's work or just your personal life. That's what I've discovered through this two plus decades of doing this work.
Yeah. And what's interesting is because you described this, I was going to talk about especially in settings where there's a lot of dysfunction and toxicity, jockeying in the medical profession, like, ERs, operating rooms. It's very, highly, high stakes, and emotions are running high. And this idea of nervous system regulation in these environments, and talking about setting boundaries and why is it so hard for some people? Their voice shakes, self-doubt. They can't show up with confidence. What's going on there?
Capacity, right? I think I actually work with a couple of physicians that are on my coaching roster right now, and we talk about like how to adjust in a moment, because you're right, it's literally life and death, right? You're talking about either, being present to be able to support somebody through a healing process or not. So when I say capacity, I mean like practicing of those moments is what allows us to be able to be in that state of regulation, or to be able to regulate when we've had, when we're dealing with trauma, right? Whether we're holding space for it or we're experiencing it ourselves, right? So I always say that it's the work that we do outside, or the practice or the ritual of regulating our nervous system outside of the moments that we need it the most, that are going to give us the access to it when we need it the most.
I've heard that term, holding space. What describe that to me, what it feels like or what it looks like. I've heard that term.
To me, holding space just means that as the leader, or as the person, say, we're speaking of physicians, as the person who is considered, the expert, or the person in the room that everyone looks to be able to hold space for all of the emotions and all of the energies that show up in the room, and to be able to, almost like, I kind of picture it almost like a juggling, right? And to be able to do that from a regulated place is such a gift, because then we, as the space holders, aren't triggered, right? Or we don't act on our triggers if somebody is responding in a way that that may not align with our own, with the way we view the world or the way we show up, right? So holding space to me just means, safety. right? Creating safety and allowing people to explore whatever they need to explore in any given moment so that we can support them in whatever way we need to.
Yeah. The other question I have is some people are highly sensitive to their environments, and especially for physicians, this idea of nervous system regulation. But at some points, is it better to find environments that are not as that are not, especially for empaths and people just kind of is it better for them to find careers or environments or situations where they're not exposed to all of that? And tell us more about that.
Well, I would never tell anyone. I would never, presume to tell anyone what to do with their life. But I do know that, when we're working in high stress environment, that it can sometimes, it can take a toll. I shouldn't say sometimes, it takes a toll, on our own physical and mental and emotional and spiritual health. And so I do think that, like, what I'm curious about in my work, when I'm working with leaders, is like, how can you make it work for you? And I know we're talking about systems, like, and I'm from Canada. I think you're in the United States. Am I right there? Or are you in Canada as well?
I'm in the States.
You're in the States, yeah. So in Canada, we have a social medical system. And so the physicians that I'm working with right now, there's two in particular, and it's not my specialty to work with physicians. It just happens to be that these two folks that I'm working with are physicians. It's different because it's a public system, right? And so, and I don't know what the system is like in the United States for doctors and for people in healthcare, but I do know that there might be ways, and this is just sort of when we can start getting curious about ways to make the system work for you. And I believe that that's how we can change systems, particularly systems that aren't serving to everyone, right? I don't know if that answered your question or not, but I do think that, yeah, like, to make it work for yourself, like if that meant working less hours, or if it meant like being in medicine or being in your chosen field, but doing it in a way that feels a little bit more aligned for you, whether it be scheduling or the populations you're working with, all of that. So I think it could be beneficial because it almost like takes the load off in some way. But I also know that a lot of doctors are pretty passionate about what they do. And so if this piece that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago is that the capacity is a little more expanded, then it might not feel as challenging and the burnout rates might be less, right?
Mhm.
If we're approaching it from a more regulated and a soul aligned space. And I know that soul aligned might not show up in the world of medicine all the time, but I think that's important too. Like, it has to fill your soul, right?
Yeah, the main thing that really resonated with me is creating more space and creating your capacity, which is really interesting. One thing is also boundaries and setting boundaries with confidence and dealing with, corporate bullies and these I call them leeches, whatever you want. But how do you setting boundaries, with confidence and kind of standing up to people, etc.
Yeah. And you did ask me about that before and I didn't answer. So thank you for swinging back around. What an important topic. What an important conversation. I think one of the main challenges for folks in corporate or in, even entrepreneurs, I work with a lot of coaches and entrepreneurs, is how do I, and permission to kind of use a little colorful language. Is that okay
Oh
with your
yeah,
audience?
yeah,
Okay.
that's
And
fine.
it's
Yeah.
not really, it's not even a swear, but I reached out on my social media platform to ask what it is that people have challenges with. And the main number one thing that folks came back with was, I want to be able to set a boundary without sounding like a dick. Right. And the thing is that I think we know boundaries. We've viewed or learned of boundaries as being really hard and rigid. Like, that's what we've witnessed boundaries being. And so, of course, like, that's a kind of a threat to our brain, right? Because we don't necessarily want to be hard or rigid, or maybe we do, but it doesn't feel good afterwards, right? Like, we kind of walk away with that, like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have said that, or I shouldn't have been, such a jerk, right? And that's actually a quote. Like, literally somebody said that. They're like, I want to be able to do this without being that, right? But I think that a really important way, and this is kind of a multi-faceted situation to be able to work through, but the most important piece is to actually check in with ourselves first, right? What sensation am I feeling? And this is before we even respond. How does that make me feel? And I'm going to put that in quotes. So it could be feeling physical sensation, like maybe it makes my heart rate rise up when the bully comes and leeches. I like that word, that leeches onto onto you or onto the, yeah. Let's like really checking in with oneself, right? And then stating, and there's actually a format of communication training that I've done as well called nonviolent communication. And it's a really great way to just like call someone out, call someone into the conversation and say, hey, you know what? I heard that. I heard what you just said. That actually doesn't feel great for me, right? What I'm interested in is, and then you can state what you're interested in and then say, I'm not interested in hearing that, or that is not how we're going to be having this conversation, or I don't want to be having that conversation with you in that way. What's possible, right? Throw it back to them with a question. Are you open to having this conversation in a way that feels a little bit more respectful? If not, then it becomes that hard, rigid place, right? And there's kind of two parts to the anatomy of a boundary, right? It's like calling someone into the conversation. I don't say calling out, even though I think I said calling out a couple minutes ago, but calling someone into the conversation. And then the second half of it is where the actual boundary comes. It's like an if by when. So if we can't have a conversation that's more respectful, I'm not going to be able to continue this conversation with you. That's the actual boundary, right? So it's not necessarily the like calling out or the in, it's the actual if by when, right? It's the like, I'm not interested in that. So if you'd like to have a conversation with me that feels a little bit more respectful to both of us, then I'm totally open to having that conversation, right?
Yeah.
So again, it's multifaceted, right? There's a lot to boundary, but I do think that it comes down to nervous system stuff again, right? Like if we're not comfortable at a like feeling safe at an embodied level to be able to speak up, are we going to feel comfortable setting a boundary or even opening up the conversation?
Yeah, really fascinating. And it's kind of like I love this idea where you're just kind of using your nervous system and kind of dealing with different environments, people, etc. Can be applied to a lot of different aspects of life. How can people contact you, follow you, check out your social media, work with you?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that, because I love to be able to share this too if people want to stay connected with me. On Instagram, I'm at Elise Besler. I have a podcast myself called The Embodied Leader. It's The Embodied Leader on Spotify, Apple, Google. And then my website is elisebesler.com. And you can check my work out there. And if you want to connect with me, I'm available.
Yeah. And for all the audience out there, let's thank Elise for coming onto the show. Like I said, really interesting how stress and trauma manifests itself, and using the breath, expressing, creating boundaries, dealing with toxic environments. And with that, thanks so much for coming onto the podcast.
Great. Thank you for having me.